Welcome to UMBC. We're here on the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. And whenever I acknowledge the land I'm on, I also take the opportunity to acknowledge the land where I do my research. And so the lands of the Maya and Xinca people in Guatemala and their communities, because all the work we do is in solidarity with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the country who are working for land and life in their own communities and on their territories. Back in the 1960s is really when Canadian mining company first emerged in Guatemala. The vast majority of companies that operate in Guatemala, mining companies, are Canadian owned. And so our book documents 4 main mining struggles against 4 main mining companies. And how that happened originally, in the 60s, it was through, agreements with the military government to get access to nickel. But as we move into the 2000s, that's a time after the internal armed conflict, after peace accords were signed, and the government really was using that moment to open up the country for foreign investment as a way to, so-called develop the country. And so it was at that moment that Canadian mining companies helped rewrite the mining law to make it favorable for them to move in and open up new mining operations. And so they are the majority of mining companies around the world. The majority are home-based in Canada, in Toronto and Vancouver, which again I think would surprise most Canadians. I don't think we know the extent to which we are a global mining giant. I went to Guatemala for the very first time as an undergraduate student in 1992, so that was when the internal armed conflict was still going on, which I didn't know as an undergraduate student going there. And it really, that summer spent there really opened my eyes to my role as a Canadian in this hemisphere, in that country. It opened my eyes to all sorts of issues around human rights and genocide that took place in the country. We had a publishing agreement with Springer Nature, which is one of the largest international publishing companies that publishes academic work, home-based in Switzerland. And we had lots of positive feedback. We took about 3 years from when we signed the contract to actually do all the work, gather all the testimonials of people we met with, return to communities and continue the documentation. And when we finally submitted the final manuscript, all signs were positive. This was going to be, the feedback we had was that it was going to be a really good title for them and was going to, have a big impact. And then all of a sudden they kind of went silent. And after a few months of wondering what was happening, we started getting strange feedback saying, the book is full of defamatory content. We need to run this through the legal team. How did you get consent from people? All sorts of things, which are appropriate questions to ask, of course. And we anticipated that we could have a dialogue on how to explain all of that, which is what an academic publisher would normally do. But the final interaction we had with them was just sending us a termination of contract, saying that the book was full of such defamatory content that no amount of editing could fix it. And we knew that wasn't correct. And we asked what the evidence was, and they never have explained what that evidence was. So we were very confident that it wasn't full of defamatory content. We were confident in our work. And so we put out a kind of a public campaign to say that this had happened to us. And we were really grateful to get support from the university, the UMBC Faculty Association, and the faculty president, the vice president of research, and our provost, who helped us petition the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is kind of the union of all faculty associations in the country. And they wanted to support us because it was an issue of academic freedom. It was an issue of actually them saying we were being defamatory, but they gave us no evidence of such. And so they actually stepped up and paid for one of the top libel lawyers in the country to do a full libel review of the book, which most academics would never have that kind of support. We were really grateful for that. And what the libel lawyer found was that there wasn't a single instance of defamatory content that would lead to such conclusions. And so it gave us confidence to then tell people that. And then immediately about 6 different publishers contacted us and said, we'd like to review the book and see if we might publish. And we were very happy to get that contact from Between the Lines Press. The tagline is they're books without bosses. They're willing to step out and publish books that shake things up, that identify issues of racism, poverty, inequality, and issues that Canadians should know more about. Yeah, we're really grateful that we were able to include the testimonials of so many brave, courageous people who are simply looking to protect their own communities, their water sources, the land for them and their children. And they're doing that at great risk to themselves and do this every day. So it really is through the collaboration with Rights Action and Graham Russell, who has worked with many of these people for decades. And it's really only through that kind of responsible relationships, trusted relationships, that someone would speak out to us on these matters. And they speak out, in different form as well. So we're grateful to know them and to return all the time. So Testimonio is really a collective remembrance of difficult, violent events. And so there are so many in the book that it'd be hard to mention one, but I'll maybe mention 2 because they are tied to kind of 2 parts of the book. So you mentioned Sebastian Iboy Osorio, who was a survivor of the Rio Negro massacre that took place in 1982. Now that is quite separate in a way from the current violence happening connected to mining. But what the connection we've tried to make in this book is that the genocide that took place, the genocides around the countryside that took place in the 70s, 80s, into the 80s, laid the foundation for the military governments to really open the country up for foreign investment. That his survival now is at stake again as mining companies move in, as hydroelectric dam construction companies move in, African palm and so on, that are all for export, that are not enriching the lives of the communities where this is all happening. They're actually suffering. And so Sebastian's story is one that reflects the courage of somebody to speak out after surviving genocide in his community. And then we have others who are like such strong women who are vocal, and women in the country, Indigenous women in particular, those like at the front. And so someone like Maria Chock and her sister Angelica Chock are very powerful women who inspire others around the country to do the same. And they not only do it at great risk, but they also are suffering in many ways. Maria has been charged and was facing 7 years imprisonment recently. Angelica her home has been attacked. She's had to go into hiding. These are people who are speaking out because they know it's right, and they know that struggle is the long story in Guatemala, and they may not see justice in their lifetime, but they certainly will lay the foundation for justice to come in the future. Professor George Lovell, a geographer at Queen's University, who long studied historical Guatemala, identified 3 conquests. The first being the invasion of the Spanish invasion. The second invasion or conquest was the invasion of international capital. So at the time, in the late 1800s, when German money was coming, American money was coming into the country for the development of coffee production, bananas, cotton, and so on. And that really transformed the land of the country into property. To be bought and sold, and again, out from under the feet of mainly Indigenous, but all poor people in the country. The third invasion, or the third conquest, Professor Lovell identifies is the state violence, the state invasion through terror and trauma and violence during the internal armed conflict. So what became known as the genocide of the late 1970s and 1980s. And so we identified this long connection, this long history of violence experienced by Indigenous people in the country and poor people in the country as now being connected to this contemporary moment of mining violence. So and many people said to us that this is like another invasion. And so now this is something that people say in the country all of the time. This is the fourth invasion. You know, these are planned and strategized actions. And so they're actions of Canadian companies and people playing out in Guatemala. So the Guatemalans are facing the terrible consequences of all of this. And those who are benefiting are almost 100% Canadian, except for, you know, a handful of Guatemalan, you know, political and economic elite. Land is seen in these instances as many different things. It's seen as property. It's seen as something to be bought and sold. For some people, it's their subsistence, livelihoods, and for many, the land is their mother. And that is something that many people have shared with us. Alfredo Perez said it in the Testimonio in our book. But for them, that's part of why they continue to resist the imposition of this imposed development model that doesn't take into consideration their connection to the land, what it means for them, and what it means for the future of their communities.